Hey, this is John. Thanks for joining me for this video today. In this video, I'm going to start building Wave Corporation's 1/20th scale Super Armored Fighting Suit Mark III Recon type Rapoon, part of the Maschinen Krieger universe. Now, if you're not familiar with Maschinen Krieger, it's a franchise that was started in Japan back in the early 80s when an artist, Kow Yokoyama, built a model from various parts and pieces and things, just kind of scratch built a model and began writing stories for Hobby Japan based on those models. So it's unusual in the fact that it's a science fiction franchise that started with the models first and then the story came afterwards. You know, most Gundam or Star Wars or Battlestar Galactica, any of those, they started as a story and then the models grew from that. But this is unusual in reversing that order, so it's kind of neat in that. The setting for Maschinen Krieger is post-World War IV apocalyptic Earth in the 29th century. There are two main factions represented in the models, the SDR, Straw Democratic Republic, which are kind of in control of things, and then there's the ones that are rebelling against them that are called basically the mercenaries. They're hired by the colonists on Earth who had returned after these apocalyptic wars to try and get their independence. So very familiar storyline, but it gives a lot of possibilities for the universe's models. Now, if you've never built a Maschinen Krieger kit, and this is one from Wave Corporation, it's a much more modern tooling. Hasegawa does some of them, and they're very modern toolings. There were older kits produced by a company that I believe it's pronounced Nido, but it may be Nido or Nido. Anyway, that are a little more multimedia, a little more harder to assemble, but not too difficult. But anyway, these Wave produced kits, Wave Corporation produced kits, are very good. They're not quite as well engineered as if you've built Gundam. They're not quite as well engineered as a Gunpla kit, but they're darn close. They are push fit, but to get them, all the panel lines and things closed up, or seam lines rather, you do want to glue it and do all your usual modeling stuff. But the instructions are fairly simple. They follow a logical progression that you see in most mecha type modeling, where you put together the arms and the legs and then the torso. One thing you will need to note if you're building a kit from Wave is there are, and Hasegawa's Maschinen Krieger kits are the same way in some regard, there are places where they've got pre-started holes that for any particular variant they'll say, well, you need to drill this out. So look for these photos like this that will tell you here's where you need to drill something. What I usually do is go through the instructions beforehand and highlight those places that I'm going to need to do it, because if you forget to do it, it can be a real pain later to try and correct that. But the assembly is very straightforward. You can, for the most part, build these up beforehand, and aside from maybe leaving a few components off just to ease painting, you can have most of it built in just a couple of hours and ready for priming and painting. The parts for any of these Wave Maschinen Krieger kits are very nicely cast with good raised detail. They have recessed detail. There's plenty of space for you to go in and add your own. If you want to add more panel lining in, add additional bits and greeblies and parts. In fact, that's part of the genre. Is many people enjoy following in the footsteps of Kow Yokoyama and not just taking this as is, but extending it and adding things to it. So it's a genre that very much invites creativity and imagination and just, doing what you want to add things to it. In addition to the normal parts you would get in a kit, just the parts on the sprues, there are, in most of them, at least some small clear pieces, which are very nicely cast and just you pop them in. Maybe you need to mask them off when you're painting, but not a lot of clear parts to work with. Most come with a fairly nicely sculpted pilot figure. Now, because of the nature of the model, it's usually just a head. There are some that have full figures in them. I know one of the Hasegawa ammonites that I built has that in it, but this is just a head, but it's a nicely sculpted figure, and because it's in 1/20th scale, it should be fairly fun to paint, and you can get in there and really get into the detail. It also comes with a sprue of what is polycap material, like this soft kind of rubbery material, and that's for the joints between the various limbs, and some places where they use the polycap so you can fit parts in, and of course there's these hoses. As I get later into the build, I'll talk about there are some challenges with painting these, and there's various ways that people get around the fact that very little will stick to this stuff for very long. But we'll talk about that as we get into the construction phase of the model. The model also comes with a really, really nice set of decals. Wave Corporation's decals are some of the best you'll find. They're on the level of quality that it makes me wonder if they were printed by Cartograph, who does the finest, in my opinion, the finest decals in the world. These are really high quality decals. Now, one of the features of the Maschinen Krieger genre is that Kow Yokoyama is a fan, he's still alive, has always been a fan of World War II aircraft, things like that. And so when he was building those original kits, he used a lot of decals from what he had, which were World War II aircraft and tanks and things like that. So that's been continued to this day, that a lot of the artwork that you'll see in the Maschinen Krieger decal sets looks very similar to what you may find on a World War II aircraft. If you know your German World War II fighters, you know there was some nose art that was very famous of a Mickey Mouse holding a couple of hatchets with a red background. Well, they've modified that, and now they have this egg shape, which is reminiscent of the shape of the fighting suit. So that's kind of a humorous nod to it. But you'll see a lot of things of, everything from like these devil kind of artworks to cards to, just things you would typically see on a World War II aircraft. All right, well, I think that's enough talking. It's time to get to building. The first thing I do is I go in and I drill out those holes that I marked in the instructions early on. Don't wait until after you've assembled it to do it, because it can be really hard to find the placement of the holes. And I don't try to be too precise. I just drill it out, and if I need to enlarge it later, I can go back on the exterior and just use my hobby knife or another drill bit to make that a little larger. And because it's just going to be places where other parts are going to be mounted on, so they don't have to be perfect at this point. Now, Wave uses undergating with their sprues, which the theory is it's supposed to make for a nice even finish on the outside because the connection points are along the edge, but I think in the end it takes the same amount of work and ends up with the same look overall. But I just clip those off, and even if there's a little bit left on the outside, I'm not worried about that. Once I get it clipped off, I get a file and I just sand that down along both mating edges to make sure that it's a good smooth fit, so that when the two parts go together, I can get a really good join. The vinyl parts, the polycap parts, you got to scrape off the seams. I just scrape away at them until I've had enough fun doing it, and then I just stop. Now, when I put the parts together, this is something I learned watching Lincoln Wright's videos on his Paint on Plastic channel on YouTube. I put the parts together but leave just a little bit of a gap, and then I go in with my Tamiya extra thin cement, and I simply just blob that in there. The capillary action will pull the paint into the join and will get the glue on both sides. And you want a fairly good amount of glue on there to do this, because once the glue's in place, all I'm going to do is I'm going to pinch those parts together, and it's going to extrude some plastic out of there. Now when you give that a little while to dry, all you have to do is go in and scrape that down, and you don't have to do a lot of sanding and filling and things like that. Usually it will work just like that. There's a few places on the model it doesn't. On the hands, take your time doing this. I do it one finger at a time. This is a snap fit model, so I snap in the first one, and then I go clip off the second one and the third one, and I put those in. I leave the pinky finger for last. Once I have those first three in there, I snap in what I guess you'd call the palm and the thumb, and that locks those others in place. Then once they're fully in place, I can do any positioning I want to the fingers, because there is a little play in them. I can do any positioning I want, and I can add some glue in there to hold everything together, and then I just pop in that little pinky finger last. And I just find that this has made it easier as I've been working on Maschinen Krieger suits over the last couple of years. And then the process is just like any other model. If you built Gunpla, it'll be familiar. You just start snapping together the various components. Now, I leave it in sub-assemblies. I don't put it all together and in one suit. I do it in sub-assemblies to make it easier to paint later, but you can do it how you want. There are some hoses that go into the leg. I wait to put those on. I don't put them on in the early assembly. I just trim down that connector there so that I can just pop it in, and it'll hold as long as you leave a little bit of a lip on it. Now for this upper torso part, I like to assemble it upside down as in reference of how it shows in the instructions. I just do it upside down from that, which allows all the parts to be balanced together, and then I can just snap that on, and it goes together pretty well. If you try and do it right side up like they show in the instructions, it can be a little bit of a frustrating experience. So I do it that way. Now you do end up with a seam line right down the middle there along the back. So you will need to go in and sand that smooth so that you get a good finish that will be prepared for the base paint and all of that will come later. But that's really the only major seam line that you've got to deal with any kind of filler. All right, I've got everything assembled. Let me show you a few modifications I made along the way. First off, I put in just this little piece of pipe there. I remembered as I was working on this, I remembered when I was in the Army and we would go to the motor pool to service our vehicles, that there was this little drain pipe that we had to check if there was moisture in the fuel line. And I thought, why wouldn't they do that on here? So I drilled a little hole in, put in a little piece of plastic rod, drilled out the end of that, and I've got a little drain pipe there. So I just stuck that in. I used my scribing needle to just scribe out around that fuel cap looking thing, just so that it gives me a little more relief there to put some wash in and do some things like that. It just makes it look like it's not just cast into the plastic, but it's a separate piece, hopefully. There's a pretty wicked seam line that runs down right here, and I decided to just duplicate the panel detail that was there and glue this piece over it. One, it meant that there was that much less of a seam line to deal with, but I just thought having a raised panel there might look pretty cool, and we'll see if I ever do that again. Now the big change I made was over here on this side. Now this one, if you build the one that doesn't have the laser arm, you're supposed to put this cover over it. But I liked the look of this, but I wanted to do the laser arm. But this is where the little tube, the little hose that runs from here into the laser arm, and I guess that's what provides the power. So I started thinking, well, how can I do something different from that? And that's where I came up with this. I stuck a couple of parts on there. These are from actually Warhammer. And this is the RPDU, Remote Power Distribution Unit. It's an experimental unit that provides power remotely from the suit to the laser. How does that work? Is that a real thing? I have no idea. Sounds good to me, and I don't have to put the hose on. So I just thought, okay, I'll do that. It'll look different. Hey, it's science fiction, right? So I'm leaning on the fiction part. Also, there was this part that goes on here. Now you'll notice there's normally a little hose that's cast in right there. I wanted to get rid of that because the way they had you put this on, it was going to be kind of at an angle here that looked kind of odd to me. Just stuck on there like that. Or actually it was going to be oriented like this. And it just looked a little odd to me because it partially covered up one end of that, but it didn't look really like the hose went into that. And it just didn't seem organic to the whole thing. So I sanded that down, sanded off the various mounting details and things that went on there. And I'm just going to put this on facing this way because I think that's where the most interesting detail is. And I'm going to put it on like it's been bolted onto the suit. Let me see if I can get it to balance on there. And I'll just put it on there like that. So there's going to be a lot going on over there. So there's going to be a lot of streaking and staining and all sorts of things. And these will look like some new add-ons, maybe with some kind of experimental suit that they're working on. So I added that on there. Also on here, I added, like I've pointed out, I've added this little detail here, just a little plastic bit. I put in a little access hatch here with a some little thing to fasten it down, so that adds some detail. I used stretched sprue to start some weld beads along here and around that, and I still need to do it on the front of this right here. And all I did was just take some of the kit's sprue and stretch it out, and I'm cutting it off into little sections and just gluing that on there, and then using the tip of my knife to just notch in some weld beads. Now another thing I've done is I've put on a couple of like bolt detail things right here, and these actually come with the kit. I had never noticed this, and I saw somebody on Facebook pointed it out. They were pointing out that you get this part that normally goes up here. Now this part will actually be going up there, but normally you put this part up here, but it's two halves, and so there's always this seam line that runs down the front and the back, and you can take care of the one on the back really easily, but the one at the front is always a little difficult because you got that little, I guess that's a camera port or something like that. Well, somebody that I was seeing on Facebook pointed out that on the A and B sprue, where it shows the letter for the sprue, they put in those little round the little camera ports right there, and you can just shave them off and glue them on there. Well, I thought, you know, I'm not going to be using that thing, but I thought that'd look pretty good as maybe some bolt detail, or I don't know, just something, just right there. So I glued them, shaved them off and glued them on there, and so I've got some additional little bolt detail happening that, you know, it's just there, just different for this suit. So anyway, I've got it all assembled, and now what I'm going to do is move on to the next step. After I do this weld bead detail, I'm going to move on to the next step, which is texturing the surface of the model. I like to use Mr. Surfacer 500 for the texturing. It's easy to find, works really well. There's certainly other products you can use, but this is my favorite. And I just apply it with an old brush, and I'm not stingy in the amount that I use on there. I put it on there fairly heavily, and what happens is the product begins to dry up, and as it dries, you continue stippling it, and that produces the textured effect. So you're very much in control of how much or how little texture you have. The more product you put on and the more you stipple it, the more texture there's going to be. If you want less of a texture, you can just put it on and maybe not stipple it much at all, and it just gives it a little bit of almost a wavy look. But it's a process that you can control and end up with the result that you want. I tend to like, I guess you would say, leaning towards a little heavier texture. I just think it looks good. I want it, part of my drive in the way I do it is I want it to show up good on camera and in video. So I do it a little heavier for that reason. Sometimes I do like masking off different panels just so they remain smooth, so that there's some textural difference. You can also, as you're doing this, you can leave just some areas with lighter texture or more texture. In my mind, I don't know that there's a lore reason for the texture, but in my mind, it's an anti-radiation, anti-laser coating that's put on after the suit has been built. So in that in that way, it may be sort of like if you've ever seen German armor that had the Zimmerit applied to it. It may be kind of like that. At least that's how I think of it in my mind. When I'm texturing panels, I try to keep the panel lines clear and distinct. Now, if you get it in there, you can go back later and rescribe it. So don't worry if you get it in there, but I just try to do it from the beginning to leave the panel lines clean so that they stay distinct and that I can put washes in them and things like that. But I just continue around the whole of the suit and do this texturing. And again, you can leave some areas untextured. It's completely up to you how you do it and what you do it with. So it's a fun process. The arm here shows an example of where I'm only doing certain areas of it. Now you can imagine that maybe that part of the arm was a replacement part and hadn't been given a texture yet, or whatever the reason. But here you can see I've only done a little bit of it to give it a certain look. Now, one of the great things about Mr. Surfacer is it cleans up with a Q-tip and alcohol. If you get to it before it dries too long and you decide, hey, I don't want any on this panel here, you can begin just rubbing that off. And all I'm using is isopropyl alcohol, nothing special. I rub it off with a Q-tip. This probably took me a total of maybe 2 minutes to rub it off, and I did it within about 30 minutes of the application. But once you get it done, it's fairly clean, and now you're resetting back to a clean panel. All right, I finished adding the texture to the parts that I wanted to. And I got to tell you, this is one of my most favorite parts of building Maschinen Krieger is this texturing process. When I first saw it, I got to be honest, before I started building these kits, I thought, well, that's kind of weird. Why would you do that? And then, I mean, when you hold it and feel that and then put paint to it and the way that you can weather it, man, it just really adds literally a dimension that's not found on any other kind of model. I guess if you're an armor modeler, you're used to it. I've never been much of an armor modeler. I was, as I've mentioned before, prior to doing science fiction, I was an airplane guy. But I just love the way this feels. And you'll note that I left some areas clean, some of them for no other reason than just to have textural differences. This area, if you're wondering why, did I decide that I didn't want it there? No, I actually deliberately did that, where I put the texture on here and then went back to clean it up later, just to show that it could be done. I generally like leaving most of these panels clean. I don't know that I, in my mind, have a specific reason for it. I just think it looks different and allows me to sometimes paint those in different colors and just treat them differently as if they're maybe have been added later, replacement panels. I know when I was in the military, we had vehicles that had panels, and sometimes those panels would break or get bent, and we would replace it with another panel. So the vehicle might be dirty and faded and everything like that, and then there'd be this one panel that would be almost brand new, or maybe be a different color than the rest of the vehicle. So there can be a lot of reasons for having those panels like that. A few parts I didn't treat at all. These various things that are going on the outside of the suit. This part that's going to go over the back of the engine panel like that, I left it untreated because I really want to rust this one out. So I want it to look like a piece of metal that was maybe hammered into shape, or added on after the fact, just as a bare chunk of metal to cover that up. I may even bend it up a little bit around the edges using some pliers or something like that. So you've got a lot of choice in how you texture it. But again, as I said during the process of doing that, you can use a lot of different products. I've used, to me, a basic putty that I thinned with nail polish remover. That works really well. If you watch any of, and I'm going to keep bringing him up because you can't bring up, in the Western world, you can't bring up Maschinen Krieger without mentioning Lincoln Wright. He is the shepherd pain to the genre. But he does several videos that show different ways of doing it. He'll actually take the Tamiya basic putty and just get it on his finger and just put it on with his finger like that. So there's a lot of ways of doing it, and it's quite fun. But now that I've got everything textured the way I want to, I'm going to move on to priming this in a darker brown color to give me some rust undertones for later chipping, and then I'll get to the painting. I've given the model a dark undercoat. It's not truly primer. When you've got this much Mr. Surfacer sitting on the top of a model, priming is not that big of a deal. But I did want that solid undercoat. So what this is a mix of 2 parts Tamiya NATO black and 1 part Tamiya Hull red, XF69 and XF9. I like this slightly darker color just because to me it's more of a rust color than just a brown. I like the way it looks. I want, with the painting technique I'm going to use, which I'm going to show you in just a second here, I want some of that chipped rust kind of look to show through. Now I'm imagining this fighting suit as a desert fighting suit. So I wanted to start off with kind of a darker, not a dark brown, but kind of a medium desaturated brown. So I'm going to use this AK Interactive Dunkel Gelb aus Gabi 44. If you're wondering what it is, it's RC061. It's obviously a German color, but I like the way it looks. Now the way I'm going to be painting this is trying to emulate the style that Lincoln Wright does his Maschinen Krieger kits in, using thinned lacquer paints and brushing them on in this dabbing motion. If you've ever seen one of his videos where he demonstrates this, the first time I saw it, I thought, this is horrible. I'll have to admit it, because I mean, I'd never seen anything like that. And but his reasoning for doing it this way is that you're essentially building in surface, different tones on the surface. There's the background poking through. There's chipping poking through. And you can give this multiple coats. The style is not to go for a complete smooth finish. I mean, coming from an aircraft background, to me, adding a base color to a model is getting a nice, smooth, complete coat. And when I first saw him doing this, and this just kind of, I mean, honestly, I thought that is the most haphazard painting method I've ever seen. But I had to step back and look at it and go, well, wait a minute, this guy is probably the most respected Western Maschinen Krieger modeler there is. I mean, he worked directly for Kow Yokoyama. He was a studio modeler. And even today, he's still closely associated with Kow Yokoyama, the originator of Maschinen Krieger. And he is their international brand ambassador. So I guess you could say when you've got that kind of seal of approval from the very inventor of what you're doing, you have to sit up and pay attention to that. So the more I listen to his videos and the more he is a friend, and I have talked to him on many occasions, both in social media and just in chat talks. But when he explains the reasoning behind this and the thinking behind it and the style that it's going for, it starts making sense to me. And it's definitely its own aesthetic. It's not, it's not the kind of thing you see on tank models or on, aircraft model or anything like that. It's definitely its own aesthetic. But I want to master this as best I can. I don't think I'll ever approach the level that Link is at, because for every model I build, he's building one, and he's already built dozens, if not hundreds, more than I have in this style. So, and he's truly an artist. I'm an emulator. I don't have an original bone in my body, but he is truly an artist. And So if you're looking at this, if you're familiar with Link's work, and you're thinking that doesn't look like Link's work, yeah, I get that. This is probably only the 4th time I've done this. But the only way to get better at something is to do it over and over. I mean, that's why Link is so good at what he does. He has done this technique and has developed it, so it's just second nature to him to sit down and start applying this paint. I do it, and I'm deliberately thinking, okay, don't hit that area. Do hit this area. You need to leave more chipping. You need to leave less chipping. The paint looks splotchy. It's as simple as it seems it would be to just dab on paint. There's some things you have to understand about lacquers. They never cure. And so they will activate whatever is underneath them. Now, even though I use Tamiya paints, which are classified as acrylics, under this, I thinned it with Mr. Color Leveling Thinner. So, in a sense, I applied them, though it was through an airbrush, as a lacquer, and so they are, they're reacting with that layer underneath. That's a desired thing. If you're wondering why I painted up that clear part, I just go back and clean it up later. It's easy enough to do so. But it reacts with that layer underneath, and you get all sorts of colors and tones and things going on. Now, I'll give it a second coat, but you see it's already starting to dry. And so it's a technique that I would say if you're building mecha of any sort, especially Maschinen Krieger, give it a try. It's different. I will, if you're coming from a traditional modeling background and you're watching this and you're going, man, that is the weirdest thing I've ever seen. Yeah, understand though, it is a definite, it's its own look. Just like the way we do armor or aircraft, you know, it looks a certain way. And if you ever see anybody step outside of that, you're thinking, wait, that's not the way you do that. But in the end, does it look cool or not? Now, one thing about this method, because of all the weathering that's going to go on top of it, and I'm going to put several more coats so that there's, you know, it's not that patchy looking on the sides. I'm on the road to where I want to be, but you have to kind of let it dry before you start putting on the additional coats. But the weathering that's going to go over this is all a foundation for it. So it's a process. That's the best I can tell you if you're not familiar with this. And I think it's definitely a style worth exploring. While I wait for that torso to dry, I just wanted to show this. This is a part that I'd painted last night, and I had the time to go in and do, I think I did, I'd call it 2.5 coats, where I went in and worked out the brush strokiness. That first, just like with any acrylic brush painting, the first one is going to look kind of brush strokey. When you put in the second one, it begins to even it out. But you see I still left in some of the poke through, as Link calls it, to designate some chipping. Now, as I'd mentioned, the lacquer paints activate the lower layers beneath it. That's why you have to be very careful. If I start painting it, you know, like you would traditionally with brush strokes, it just smears the stuff. So that's why the application technique is the way it is. And when you put on multiple coats, it gives you a much better opacity. And it's actually, once it's on there, it's actually dries very smooth. Now, of course, there's some texture to the model, but the way it dries is very smooth. So it provides a great foundation for the later weathering. And even if you put another color over the top of this, which I'm going to do, it kind of does the same thing. It activates it, it kind of blends it together. It's definitely a technique that requires a little bit of work to master. I'll admit, the first time I did it, the technique was definitely in control of me. I was not in control of it. I only feel like I'm starting to get to the point where I feel comfortable with doing it. And part of me still looks at it, the aircraft modeler still looks at it and goes, man, that looks bad. But I know that what will happen is this is a foundation. And later weathering and other things that are going to happen over it are going to make it look the way I'm wanting it to look, which is, as I've said, is a particular aesthetic. It's not your traditional Western, start off with a smooth color on your tank and then beat it up. This is starting off beat up and then continuing to weather on top of that. So I'm going to give the parts that I've done a little time to dry, give them a second coat, and then I'll go in and do a second camo color. All right, I've given this a second coat and it's looking much more like I wanted it to look. I'm still not going to claim mastery of the technique, but this is getting in the right direction. I'm much happier with this result than I was with my previous attempts at this. So I'm liking the way it looks. When you're painting this on, every now and then you may get bubbles in the paint. That's okay. Just use the brush to pop them. You can even let them dry, and then I've gone back and just taken actually a toothpick and damped it in the thinner and just kind of touched around the bubble, and that'll reactivate the paint and get that bubble to settle down. You can cut them off to give it kind of a damaged look. But what I want to do now is I want to provide the second camouflage color. I'm going to do something else that I've seen Link do. This was the base color that I used. What I've watched him do quite often is instead of just going in and adding a second color as the second color on the camo, he'll take another color and mix it in with this, so there's some cohesiveness between the underlying color and the camo color. Well, I wanted kind of a bluish color on top of this desert color. If you've seen, there were some British tanks, I can't remember what they were called, but they had that kind of camo where it was kind of a sand and then there was kind of a blue-gray over. And I've always thought that looked kind of cool. So what I did was I mixed a little bit of this AK Interactive Real Color Blue in to this Dunkelgelb. And I also added in just a little bit of dark gray to desaturate it a bit. And what I ended up with was this color. Now, if you want to know what my ratio was, I can't tell you. It was roughly whatever was left in the palette of the tan color, and then I put in 2 drops of blue and 1 drop of gray, and I mixed it around. And I thought, it needs a little more of this, and so I put in just a little bit more gray, and I mixed it, and when it got to what I call the TLAR standard, that looks about right, then I said that's what I'm going to go with. So it's whatever you want it to be. And then of course I put the thinner in here. Now I've switched to this smaller brush to add in the camo pattern, and all I'm going to do is just as I saw him do, I was watching the videos last night to refresh my memory, but I'm just going to sketch in the line that I want to use for the camo pattern, and I'm using roughly the same application technique that I did on the rest of it, and I'm just going to put that in there. And what it's going for is putting in, you want the darker color where the highlights would be and the lighter color where the shadows would be, so that at a distance it blurs the shape. And this actually makes sense, because when I was in the Army, when I was at infantry school, and they were teaching us how to camouflage our faces, they taught us that the darker colors went where the lighter parts of your face were, the bridge of your nose, your eyebrow, your cheekbones, stuff like that. The lighter colors went where the shadows were. And I think the intent was that it would hopefully flatten out the face, because we're real good at picking out faces when we look around. We see faces very easily. Our mind is just open to interpreting something or seeing something as a face. So if you're a soldier and you're out there in the woods and you're moving along, you don't want to be seen. So we would use that thinking to apply the camo. And it's the exact same thinking here. Now you'll notice here I'm going for a little more fuller coverage because my thinking is this paint is added later, and so it's a thicker coat, and thus there will be less chance of things getting down to the lower levels of the material, I guess you'd say. Now I am going to add later chipping to this, but, and I apologize for getting off camera because I'm having to lean over to work around the camera. But I'll continue painting this pattern in, and with these principles in mind, and show you what that looks like. All right, I've got that camo color laid in there. You can see some of it is still drying, and I like that. I like those two colors together. That's pretty much what I was going for in my head. So yeah, I'm happy with that. Now just to show you a few of the other bits, that's the laser arm that I did there. And again, I'm thinking in terms of, facing the front or lifting it up. Where is the highlight and where is the shadow going to be? On the foot, it's the part that sticks out from under the rest of it the most that's going to need the shadow. And then on the leg, that forward part is what is going to stand out. And from above and from the front, this is going to be more in shadow. I thought about doing this, but I decided to leave it because I just liked this the way it ended up. So there's a little more on the outside of the leg than on the inner part of the leg. So hopefully it'll get across the notion that it's trying to disguise the highlights and flatten out the shadows and create a sensible camo pattern. All right, with those base colors laid in, I'm going to go ahead and paint a few other little details, get some other things glued onto the suit, and then see where we go from there. All right, I think the final step before I wrap up the video will be to apply some decals. Now, I'm not going to apply a gloss coat to the model. Here's why. If I apply a gloss coat, one, because of the texture, it's still going to have some roughness to it. So I'm still going to have to work harder than I would on a non-textured model to get any air bubbles out from under the decals so there's no silvering. Second reason I'm not going to gloss coat it is for the weathering, I don't want the gloss coat. So if I apply a gloss coat, it's going to give me some benefit for the decals, but not a whole lot. And then I'm going to have to go back and add a satin coat, would have to add a satin coat to do the weathering. So what I do is when I put down the decals, I put down just a dot of future, almost as a setting solution. That will pull the decal down nicely, and then I can put Solvaset over it. If I need to go back later and poke a few holes here and there and put some Solvaset in, I can do that. Then all I have to do is touch up that one area with a satin varnish by brush. And then once that is dry, I'm ready to go in and do my weathering and not having to put a whole lot of different clear coats on it to prepare for the weathering. So let me get one of these decals on and I'll show you what I'm talking about. All right, I've dipped my decal in warm water so it's loose from the backing paper. And all I'm going to do is take an old brush and I'm going to put just a little puddle of future there. And then I'm going to grab my decal, if I can get hold of it, and slide that off. And then taking my X-Acto knife, because I like living dangerously, I'll just settle that in place like so. And then grabbing my handy dandy cotton bud, I'll roll that around to work out the air. And that's also spreading the future underneath the decal, which is the key to this, because that's what's going to reduce or totally eliminate your bubbles. Because the future will coat the underside of the decal. When it dries, it'll pull the decal right down to the surface. Now, I'll still hit this with some Solvaset in a few minutes, but that decal should work pretty well without gloss coating the whole model. Once the solva set is dry and the decal has been in place for a little bit, I'll just brush on some matte varnish if I think it needs it. If enough of the gloss didn't get out from under it, I won't even worry about it. But that's a way, if you're just putting on a few decals and you don't want to be putting a lot of clear coats on your model, you can do it that way. Saves a little time, takes a little more extra care, but it works well. All right, I've got some initial decals on here, and you can see it's looking pretty decaled. I chose that little owl image for the kind of, I guess you'd call it nose art. I've got the G up there on the top, and another one on that side also. Now I'll go in and add a few more stencils, not a lot, just a few stencils here and there. And I've still got to, the little piece that I'm going to put right here, I still need to paint that. I'm going to do it in a different color. I haven't decided what that'll be yet, and glue that on there. I'd waited until now so that I could get all of this painted and didn't have to worry about that being there. And I'll just scrape away a little of the paint, and I'll just scrape it down to the bare plastic where I'm going to glue it and glue the part on there, and it'll be a good hold there. Thank you so much for watching this video today. I am so very grateful that you've chosen to do so. If you've not subscribed to my channel, please click on the subscribe link down there somewhere and hit the little bell icon so that you'll know when I have new videos that come out. If you're already a subscriber, thank you for doing that. There's also links down below and to the various social media platforms of which I wander about. And if you wander about some of those yourself, then please consider following me there. I would be grateful for that. There's also a link down below to Patreon. That's really what makes the work that I do possible. If it wasn't for that, I would still model, certainly, but I would not be able to do it at the pace that I do it with the amount of materials and kits and things that I can do, hosting the website, all of those things without Patreon. We simply couldn't afford for me to do it. So if you would consider supporting me on Patreon, I would be most grateful. My family would too. And if you're already a Patreon supporter, thank you so much for doing that. I can't tell you how much it means to me. And I do hope you're enjoying the benefits that you get from being a patron. Well, if you've never tried one of these Maschinen Krieger kits, I highly recommend them. They're a lot of fun. They're really fun to weather, as you're going to see in part 2 of this video series. And they're one of my favorite things to work on. They really are. So give them a shot. I think you'll like them. With all that being said, I'll leave you with one final thought. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.